listener, remember to gently tap like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Tonight, I'll take you through the quiet halls where the walls still breathe, where every sound means something, even when no one's there to make it. 5 stories, each one a whisper left behind by those who never truly left. So, turn down the lights, lie still, and listen carefully, because some sounds don't stop when you wake up. Story 1, The Orchard That Answers Back. I arrived at the orchard just after dusk, the mist weaving itself gently between the apple trees, drifting in long pale ribbons that clung to the soil like slow breath. The air felt unusually heavy, carrying a quiet that made every step sound louder than it should, as though the earth itself was listening. I moved deeper between the trees, my boots pressing into the soft ground, and for a moment I sensed something beneath the surface give way slightly, not in the normal way soil shifts, but in a deliberate manner, almost as if recognizing me, welcoming me, though I had never been here in my life. The orchard should have been filled with the small sounds of evening, yet there were none. No birds settling into branches, no insects rising with the damp air, nothing but the faint creaking of limbs swaying without any wind to push them, a rhythm too slow and too careful to be natural. Then I heard it, a single sharp snap behind me, the distinct crack of a twig breaking under weight, close enough to stir the back of my neck. I turned at once, scanning the rows of trees fading into mist, each one still and patient, yet the echo of that sound returned softer, drawn out, repeating itself as though something unseen was answering me from the fog. The second echo of that broken twig hung in the fog longer than it should, lingering like a breath someone was too afraid to release. And as I stood there listening, I felt the orchard tighten around me, the air drawing closer with a strange, expectant hush. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer, a fox wandering through the trees. Yet the sound had been too precise, too intentional, landing with the weight of something that knew exactly where to step. And the more I thought about it, the more the mist around me seemed to shift in ways that matched my breathing. As though responding to it, I took another step forward, slow and careful, letting my foot press into the soft soil. And somewhere behind me, hidden by the milky veil of fog, another step followed, delayed by a heartbeat, mirroring mine with unsettling accuracy. The faint press of weight on wet ground, the suction of mud giving way, the faintest rustle of leaves caught under something that was definitely not me. The orchard no longer felt open, no longer a simple grid of trees, but a narrowing corridor that urged me forward while something followed behind. Each step of mine echoed, softened, reshaped, and returned like a whisper tugging at the back of my coat. The rows of apple trees seemed to lean closer, their branches crossing overhead as though forming an arch leading me somewhere I had not agreed to go. I lifted my hand to brush away a strand of mist, and as my fingers moved, I heard it again. Not a snap this time, but a quiet shift, the soft friction of bark being touched or leaned against, happening just slightly after my own gesture. Like a delayed reflection watched through a warped mirror, my heartbeat rose, yet the orchard felt even quieter, as though absorbing the quickening pulse and feeding it back in faint vibrations under my boots. I felt something in the soil tremble, a gentle quiver that contrasted the absolute stillness above ground, and the sensation traveled up my legs in a slow, creeping wave, making the hairs on my arms lift despite the still air. I whispered a small greeting, half a joke to break the tension, half an instinctive attempt to claim my presence out loud. And the moment my voice faded, a faint murmur surfaced from somewhere deep between the trees, too soft to understand, too close to ignore, carrying the tone of someone trying to imitate the exact sound I had just made. The orchard answered me, not fully, not clearly, but enough for something cold to settle between my ribs, enough to make me realize that whatever was following my steps was no longer keeping distance. Its imitations were becoming more confident, more curious, and far more aligned with my movements than any creature should be capable of. And as I stood there in that thickening fog, surrounded by trees that felt older than their bark suggested, I sensed the first shift in the orchard's breathing, a slow inhalation drawn from the earth itself, as though the place was preparing for something that required silence, anticipation, and my complete attention. The murmur that rose from the orchard did not fade the way a natural sound should. Instead, it stretched itself thin through the mist, lingering with a trembling persistence that seemed to crawl across the branches and settle beneath the skin of the trees. And when I took a careful step forward, the ground responded with a low throb, as if the soil itself had learned to mimic the sound of a beating heart. Slow, heavy, and disturbingly aware of my presence, I paused, listening, letting the quiet wrap around me. Yet the quiet was no longer empty. It carried faint shifts, soft rustles, the tiny vibrations of bark scraping against bark, each movement slightly delayed, not quite matching the rhythm of the orchard around me, but aligning almost perfectly with the rhythm of my breath, my pulse, the small, hesitant sounds my body made as I tried to stand perfectly still. Somewhere to my left, a branch bent under weight. The groan of wood long settled into age, stretching into a low tremor. And before I could turn fully toward it, something echoed the movement on my right. A quieter groan, softer, fainter, as though the orchard were learning how to imitate the first sound more naturally, adjusting itself to fit the tone and cadence of what it had heard. I told myself to leave, to turn back toward the entrance where the mist had been thinner. Yet, with every step I attempted, another sound rose behind me, mirroring the motion with unsettling precision. The squelch of soil giving way, the whisper of leaves pressed aside, a rhythm building between my movement and its reply, creating a cadence like a call and response that tightened around my thoughts until I could not tell which sound was mine and which belonged to the unseen presence threading through the trees. The deeper I walked, the louder the orchard became, though never with noise so clear that I could identify it. Instead, the sounds built layer upon layer, a soft chorus of subtle creaks and breath-like shifts, punctuated by the occasional sharp snap of a branch overstressed by weight that seemed to move just out of sight. Each sound came with its own echo, delayed but obedient, and I realized with a slow dawning dread that the orchard was not just imitating me, it was learning me, memorizing every motion, every tiny resonance that followed my steps. A cold ripple spread across the ground, a vibration that traveled from one tree root to another, passing beneath my feet like a warning disguised as curiosity. And for the first time, I sensed a deeper rhythm under the orchard's mimicry. Something older, something that had waited long enough to recognize the patterns I carried with me. My pace, my breath, my hesitation, even the subtle tremble of my fingers as they brushed against the damp air. I lifted my hand again, slowly, deliberately, to see if the orchard would follow. And it did. A tree somewhere ahead rustled its leaves in the same slow arc, matching the movement but dragging it out, elongating it as though savoring the effort of imitation. And when I lowered my hand, another branch creaked in a downward sweep, completing the mirrored gesture with an eerie grace that made my skin tighten and my throat grow dry. The sounds around me were no longer isolated or random. They formed a pattern, a growing harmony of quiet scratches, shifting roots, and weight pressing into wet soil. A tangled symphony that rose and fell in response to every breath I took. And with each new echo, the orchard seemed to pull closer. The mist thickening, the air tightening, until the distance between me and whatever was learning me felt terrifyingly thin. Then, from deep in the fog ahead, came a new sound, louder than the rest, a heavy, deliberate step, not echoing me this time, but asserting its own rhythm, a slow approach that made the branches shudder and the soil tremble in a way that felt far too directed to be natural. It was the first sound that did not follow me, the first sound that led, and the orchard responded to it with a hush so immediate and complete that even my own breath seemed too loud in my ears. And as that step came again, closer now, pressing deep into the ground with purpose, the entire orchard seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting, listening, preparing for something that wanted me to hear it clearly, without confusion, without mistaking it as my own reflection. The heavy step ahead pressed into the earth again, a slow sinking weight that traveled through the soil and into my legs like a distant pulse. And for the first time since entering the orchard, I felt the air behind me lean forward as though the entire space had taken a collective breath, drawing closer to witness what would happen next. The mist tightening around my ankles like a patient hand waiting for instruction. I hesitated, not moving, letting my breath thin itself into the fog until it no longer felt separate from the orchard around me. Yet the presence ahead did not hesitate in return. Another step followed, firmer, more deliberate, a measured sound that suggested something tall, heavy, and absolutely certain of its direction. And the moment the weight settled into the soil, the trees on either side of me responded with a brittle shiver, their branches bending in a slow ripple as though bowing toward the source. I shifted my foot back instinctively, and immediately behind me came the echoing reply, softer but unmistakable, a mirrored step pressed into the damp ground, and the roots beneath my heel trembled with a strange familiarity, as though the orchard itself approved of the movement, encouraging the rhythm that had begun to bind my steps with those of the unseen pursuit. The louder presence ahead exhaled, not in breath, but in movement, a broad sweep of branches being parted or disturbed, sending a wave of soft rustles rolling toward me, and with it came a low resonance, a subsonic hum that vibrated in my ribs and made the back of my throat tighten. The kind of sound that did not belong to breath or wind, but to something that understood how to use stillness as a voice. I raised my lantern slightly, letting the faint glow seep into the fog. And the moment the light shifted, the orchard answered. Somewhere to my right, a tree groaned upward, stretching as if following my gesture. And to my left, another branch creaked downward, completing the mirrored movement in a slow, uneven dance that made me feel as though I were being surrounded by reflections of myself, distorted by wood and mist. I whispered a soft greeting again, partly to steady my voice, partly to test the orchard's response. And this time, the answer came immediately. Not as a murmur, but as a clear attempt to mimic the shape of my whisper. A hushed note rising from between the trees that carried the faint contour of my own voice, stretched thin, pulled into a strange, uncertain echo that wavered like someone learning how to speak for the first time. The heavy presence ahead shifted once more, and I realized with a quiet dread that it was no longer moving toward me randomly. It was circling, slow and deliberate, its steps creating a wide arc that tightened around my position. And with each step, the trees around me leaned subtly inwards, as though angling their trunks to listen more closely or to guide whatever was approaching into a more perfect path. I took a nervous step backward, and once again the orchard behind me followed with its echo. But this time the sound was louder, closer, as if the mirrored presence had reduced the distance between us, shortening the delay so that my movement and its reply nearly blended together, creating a braid of sound that made the air feel denser, heavier, charged with a tremor that seemed to vibrate along my skin. Through the thickening fog, I saw a faint shift of shape ahead. Not a clear figure, but the suggestion of height, of something tall, standing between the trees, absorbing the lantern glow without reflecting it back. A silhouette defined not by outline, but by the absence of light itself. And as I stared, the shape tilted, a slow, angled movement like a head turning to observe me with patient curiosity. The orchard fell utterly silent, every echo stilled, every creak suspended, as though the entire place were waiting for my reaction, testing the boundary between fear and obedience. And I felt a trembling tension rise beneath my feet again. A subtle adjustment of roots and soil preparing for motion, preparing for response, preparing perhaps for something that required my participation. I managed a single step toward the silhouette, not out of courage, but because the silence demanded it. And the moment my foot touched the ground, the shape ahead straightened with a soft, shifting sound, a deep chord of movement rolling through the fog like a low-drawn breath. And behind me, the mirrored presence took its step as well, sealing me between them with a perfect echo that reverberated through the orchard like the closing of a great unseen door. For the first time, I sensed their alignment, the way the heavier presence ahead and the mimicking echo behind moved in tandem, creating a corridor of intention that held me still. And deep beneath the soil came a rising vibration, slow but inevitable, as if something buried beneath the orchard were stirring, called awake by my confrontation with the silent figure in the fog. And as I stood suspended in that narrowing space, the silhouette began to move, drawing nearer in a slow, gliding motion that made no sound of its own, but caused the trees around it to sway, releasing faint tremors that traveled outward like ripples on dark water. And with each ripple, the orchard felt more aware, more alive, more intent on revealing whatever secret waited within the shifting mist directly in front of me. The silhouette in the fog halted just short of the lantern's faintest reach, its form wavering like a tall shadow carved out of denser mist. And for a long, suspended moment, nothing stirred between us. No echo behind me, no creak from the trees, only a heavy stillness that felt strangely relieving, as though the orchard itself had settled, loosening the tight grip it had held around my ribs since the first sound followed my steps. I stood completely still, letting the faint warmth of the lantern seep into my hands, reminding me that I was not entirely swallowed by the orchard, that there was at least one point of human light left to anchor me. And as I waited, the silhouette softened, losing its sharpness, dissolving slightly into the fog, and I felt my breath ease for the first time since entering the orchard's depths, my shoulders lowering gently as if some unseen pressure had lifted away. Behind me, the echoing presence grew quiet, its mimicry fading until I could no longer hear the soft weight of its delayed steps. And in that rare silence, I let myself believe the orchard had retreated, withdrawing its strange attention, perhaps satisfied with observing me from a distance, or perhaps simply losing interest in whatever it had sensed earlier. The mist drifted in a calmer rhythm now. The faint swaying of the trees no longer matched my breaths or heartbeat, and instead moved with a natural softness that reminded me of the quiet evenings I had expected to find here. Peaceful, undisturbed, the sort of calm that convinces even the most anxious mind that nothing out of place had truly happened. I took a slow step forward, and for the first time the orchard did not answer. There was no mirrored step following mine, no subtle rustle echoing my movement, only the soft press of soil beneath my boot and the muffled drift of mist parting around my legs. And the absence of the echo felt like a soothing balm, a gentle reassurance that perhaps I had misheard, misinterpreted, imagined a threat built from fog and fatigue. The silhouette in front of me continued to thin, dissolving into strands of pale movement that curled and uncurled with the breeze, and I watched as pieces of it unraveled into the air, leaving behind nothing but a faint, darker patch of mist. Then even that melted away, leaving only ordinary darkness between the trees. A darkness that no longer stared back or leaned forward in anticipation. I lowered my lantern slightly, feeling its warmth steady my hands, and allowed myself a quiet laugh, soft and shaky, the sort of sound one makes after realizing they had let the night play tricks on their nerves. And as the laugh faded, the orchard remained silent, not imitating the sound, not repeating it, simply letting it pass without response. I breathed out slowly, relieved, letting the tension slip from my shoulders as I considered turning back toward the entrance, imagining the reassuring sight of the fence and the familiar path leading out of the fog. And with each passing second, the idea of leaving felt more natural, as though the orchard had released its hold entirely and was allowing me to return to a world that did not breathe or listen or mimic. Yet as I turned slightly, preparing to take another step, my foot brushed against something half buried in the soil, a small object hidden just beneath the surface, and I crouched down, brushing away the damp earth with my fingers, expecting a fallen apple or a stray root, but instead revealing a smooth piece of wood, carved with faint grooves that looked almost like markings. Long, thin indentations repeating themselves in a curved pattern that felt strangely familiar. The lantern's glow caught the surface, flickering along the carved lines, and as I traced them with my thumb, a cold recognition trickled through me, for the pattern matched the exact path my fingers had absent-mindedly followed along the bark earlier. The same pattern, the same direction, the same pressure, preserved in this small, buried piece of wood, as though the orchard had captured the motion and stored it here, waiting for me to find it. For a heartbeat, the fog around me seemed to inhale again, drawing close with a subtle shift. Still soft, still quiet, but no longer empty, as though the calm had been a temporary veil, a gentle illusion draped over something that had never truly stopped watching, never truly stopped listening, never truly stopped marking every movement I made in this silent, listening place. And as I held the carved piece in my hand, the soil beneath my boots trembled with a faint rising vibration, so small it could be mistaken for imagination, yet too deliberate, too focused, carrying the subtle message that the orchard had not released me at all. It had only paused, waiting for me to understand the first clue it had chosen to offer. The small carved piece of wood rested in my palm with a weight that felt far too heavy for its size, as though the grooves etched into it carried not only the memory of my touch but the attention of the orchard itself. And as I knelt there, with the mist curling slowly around my wrists, I felt the soil beneath me pulse again, this time stronger, rising through the ground in a slow, expanding wave that spread outward like a breath being drawn from deep below the roots. I stood quickly, the carved piece still in my hand, and the moment my weight shifted, the orchard answered with a shudder that rippled through the trees, a synchronized tremor of branches and leaves that produced a low droning hum, the sound vibrating in my ribs and climbing steadily toward my throat, leaving me unable to tell whether the hum came from the trees or from the soil pulsing beneath my boots. The mist around me thickened, pulling itself inward as though drawn by a hidden tide, swirling faster and faster, and with each curl of movement came faint impressions of shapes forming and dissolving, silhouettes that resembled my own gestures, as reflections of my earlier steps, the orchard replaying fragments of my presence the way a memory replays itself in a dream. And within that drifting fog I heard the echo of my laugh from moments ago, stretched thin and distorted as though being replayed by a throat made of wood and wind. I backed away, clutching the carved piece, and the ground directly behind me responded with another mirrored step. But this step was no longer soft or delayed. It landed with weight, with intention, pressing deep into the soil with a force that sent a tremor up my spine. And I realized then that the mimic behind me had drawn close enough to match my movements almost immediately, its presence no longer a distant echo but a shadow pressed close to my heels. The orchard's hum rose, layered and resonant, swelling until the air itself seemed to vibrate, and the branches overhead tilted inward, narrowing the path between the trees into a corridor of shifting limbs that moved in subtle unison, guiding me forward, urging me toward the heart of the orchard where the mist churned in a slow, spiraling column of gray and silver. A vortex of breath and movement that pulsed in time with the vibrations beneath the soil. I turned toward the direction of the entrance, but the orchard closed behind me, branches lowering, roots shifting beneath the fog, sealing the way I had come in, creating a wall of living wood that bent and tensed like the muscles of an enormous unseen creature. And the hum deepened, becoming a resonant tone that matched the rhythm of my heart with unsettling precision. The silhouette that had once dissolved in front of me reformed now, emerging from the curling mist with greater clarity, its height towering above the nearest tree, its edges shifting like bark breaking and regrowing in a continuous rhythm. And as it stepped forward, the soil dipped beneath its invisible weight, sending another jolt through the ground that made my knees tremble. The mimic behind me shifted as well, and for the first time I sensed its form, not through sight, but through the weight of its presence pressing into the air. A shape that mirrored mine but stretched taller, broader, as though echoing me imperfectly, exaggerating what it thought I should be. And when I breathed, it breathed, but slower, deeper, the sound rolling through the mist like a long-drawn inhalation from a hollow chest. Trapped between the towering silhouette and its warped reflection of me, I felt the orchard close its invisible grip, the hum rising into a single, continuous note that reverberated through my bones, a sound that seemed to reach inside my ribs and nudge my heartbeat into alignment with its rhythm. And the carved piece in my hand grew warm, the grooves pulsing faintly as though responding to the orchard's call. With a trembling hand, I lifted the piece, and immediately the trees responded, their branches bending toward it in sweeping arcs, as though drawn by the memory engraved upon its surface. And the vortex of mist ahead tightened, pulling inward like an eye narrowing in concentration, focusing on the motion of the small wooden token rising slowly in the air. The silhouette stepped closer, its movement gliding rather than walking, and as it neared, the hum shifted, the tone dropping into a deeper resonance that made the lantern flicker violently, its flame straining against the dense breath of the orchard. And I sensed that the figure wanted the carved piece, needed it, perhaps to complete the memory it had taken from me, perhaps to continue shaping its echo of my presence into something fully formed. Fear surged through me, sharp and sudden, shaking me free from the orchard's slow, hypnotic rhythm. And without thinking, I pulled my arm back, clutching the carved piece tightly against my chest, and I stumbled backward away from the reaching branches, away from the looming silhouette, my boots scraping against the trembling soil. The orchard reacted at once, the hum breaking into a cascade of jagged sounds, branches snapping, roots twisting, leaves whipping through the air with a rising ferocity that sent the mist swirling into wild spirals around me. And the mimic behind me lunged forward, its weight crashing into the ground with force that shook the trees, closing the space between us with terrifying speed. I ran, forcing my legs through the thickening fog, pushing against the trembling earth that rose and fell beneath my feet like the surface of a breathing beast. And every step I took was answered by crashing echoes behind me, loud and immediate, no longer delayed or softened. The mimic now following not with imitation but with pursuit. The lantern swung wildly in my hand, its light cutting fragments of golden arcs through the fog, revealing glimpses of twisting branches and shifting shadows that pressed close on either side. And the hum of the orchard rose into a frenzied chorus, the once unified tone breaking into hundreds of overlapping vibrations. each one urging the trees to close in, to pull me back toward the heart of the orchard. Ahead, through the boiling mist, I saw a faint thinning of the fog, a pale opening where the air seemed clearer, the soil firmer beneath the surface, and I pushed toward it with everything I had, clutching the carved piece so tightly its edges dug into my palm, anchoring me to a memory that had not yet been stolen. As I neared the opening, the orchard surged one final time, the soil rising beneath me like a wave, roots thrusting upward in a tangled mass that sought to catch my ankles, to pull me down, to hold me in place long enough for the mimic's crashing steps to reach me, and the towering silhouette's shadow swept across the mist with an urgent, closing motion. With a desperate burst of strength, I hurled myself forward, leaping over the twisting roots, my boots slamming onto firmer ground as the mist thinned around me, and behind me the orchard roared in a cacophony of cracking branches and rising hums, its furious chorus echoing through the night as I broke free of its closing grasp. I did not stop until the first clean breath of open air hit my lungs, cold and sharp, cutting through the lingering tremor the orchard had left inside my chest. And only then did I look back into the heaving fog where the trees bent and trembled, reaching outward with a longing motion that halted just at the threshold, unable or unwilling to cross into the world beyond its mist. And in my hand, the carved piece pulsed once more, faint and warm, as though something within the orchard had not yet finished speaking to me. I stood at the edge of the orchard, my breath uneven, the carved piece warm against my palm as though it held a heartbeat of its own. And for a moment, I let myself believe I had truly escaped, that the thinning mist and the trembling trees behind me marked the boundary the orchard could not cross, a line it would not breach. Yet as I turned to leave, the soil at my feet shifted with a faint ripple, a gentle wave that did not come from the orchard's direction, but from the open field ahead. The night air felt wrong, too still, too aware, and when I lifted the carved piece to the lantern's glow, the grooves along its surface had deepened, subtle but undeniable. New lines added to the old, lines I had not traced, markings that curved in patterns resembling the paths my feet had taken during my desperate escape. Each indentation a record of my movement carved with impossible speed, as though something had continued observing me even after I broke free from the mist behind me. The orchard quieted, its branches settling into an uneasy stillness. Yet the silence did not comfort me, for from the open darkness before me came a low, soft sound, a sound so familiar it froze my breath in my throat, the faint, delayed echo of my last step, repeating itself with the same hesitant rhythm the orchard had used before, except this time it came from far beyond the boundary of the trees. I took a single cautious step backward, toward the fence line, and the echo followed from the field. Not perfect, not yet aligned, but close enough to feel deliberate, intentional, learning me all over again, as though the mimic inside the orchard had slipped free and carried my reflection into the world beyond the mist. The carved piece pulsed once more in my hand, a warm quiver that traveled up my wrist and into my chest. And in the faint lantern light, I saw the newest groove forming in real time, carving itself with slow, deliberate pressure, a fresh mark shaped after the step I had just taken, proving that whatever had followed me had not remained behind. And as the echo of my movement came again from the open field, closer this time. The lantern flame trembled, bending toward the sound as though drawn to it, and I realized with a cold, sinking clarity that the orchard had not tried to stop me at all. It had simply chosen to follow me into the dark. Story 2. The corridor that remembers footsteps. My name is Elias Ward, and on a cold November night in 2022, at precisely 23:15, I found myself standing in the east corridor of Greywell Guest House in Whitby, North Yorkshire, a place whispered about by travelers for its strange refusal to echo even the lightest footstep. And as I stepped onto the thick crimson carpet, the air around me felt unnervingly hushed, as though the entire house were holding its breath. The gas lamps mounted along the wooden panels, casting long, unmoving shadows that seemed to watch my approach with patient curiosity. And with each slow step I took, the corridor swallowed the sound instantly, leaving no trace of my movement, no hint of my presence, nothing but the soft shifting of my breath in the cold stillness. I walked a little deeper, letting my fingers glide along the dark, polished wainscoting, and just as I reached the first bend in the hall, a faint sound rose behind me, delicate yet unmistakable. A single footstep landing half a beat after mine, too precise to be an accident, too gentle to be a guest wandering at this hour. And when I turned, the empty corridor behind me stretched silent and unbroken. Yet the delayed echo of that step lingered in the air like a breath someone else was trying to hide. The soft, delayed footstep behind me faded slowly into the thick carpet, leaving a tremble in the air that clung to my skin like a whisper of breath. And as I listened, the silence of Greywell Guest House seemed to deepen in a way I had not expected, a silence that felt sculpted rather than natural, as though the corridor itself had been designed to swallow sound with deliberate hunger, leaving no trace of anything that moved within it. I took a cautious step forward, testing the floor beneath me, and once again my movement vanished without a hint of echo. Yet from somewhere just behind my left shoulder came a faint reply. The soft press of weight into carpet, a footstep shaped exactly like my own but landing half a beat later, a mimicry too precise to dismiss. I turned my head slowly, keeping my lantern raised, watching the gaslight shimmer along the brass fixtures and curve into the distant corner of the hall. But nothing shifted there. No shadow withdrew. No guest retreated into a room. And the deeper I stared into that stillness, the more it seemed to breathe in quiet increments, expanding and contracting with a patience that unsettled the edges of my thoughts. The corridor felt longer than before, stretching subtly as though coaxing me to walk further, to give it more footsteps, to absorb, more movements to record. And the air carried a faint scent of old varnish and winter dust, mingling with something colder, something that reminded me of stone chambers sealed for decades. I whispered my own name into the silence, a small, steadying gesture, and my voice drifted down the hall without echo, dissolving instantly into the heavy air. But a second later, a faint murmur rose behind me. Not my full name, but the soft cadence of the last syllable, as though spoken by someone unsure of their tongue, someone trying to shape the sound but lacking the breath to complete it. And the hairs along my arms lifted in a slow, creeping wave, stirred by the realization that whatever followed my steps was now attempting to follow my voice as well. I stepped backward, slowly, deliberately, letting my boots sink into the plush carpet, and the corridor behind me mirrored the motion with another step. Closer now, the rhythm tightening until it felt like someone standing just out of sight was waiting for me to move again. Waiting for a cue. Waiting to fall into place behind me like a shadow, learning to walk. 5. I breathed in deeply, feeling the cold of the air settle in my lungs, and the faintest tremor in the wainscoting caught my eye. A subtle shiver moving along the wood grain, as though something brushed the wall from the inside. Tracing the length of the corridor, parallel to my spine, the lamps flickered once, their flames bowing inward, and I felt the hush deepen again. A deliberate quiet that pressed against my ears as though urging me to listen more closely, to notice the faint rustle of carpet fibers shifting behind me, the soft glide of something adjusting its weight, aligning itself with my breathing, matching the slow rhythm of my heartbeat, growing bolder with each replicated sound. And as I stood suspended in that narrowing hush, it struck me with cold clarity that the corridor was not simply absorbing echoes, but learning them, storing them, and now it was beginning to play them back. The corridor seemed to inhale around me, drawing the cold November air into its long, narrow body. And as I stood in that breathless stretch of carpet and wood, the faint echo of my last step began to repeat itself in a soft, irregular rhythm, not once but twice, then again, as though the hall were replaying the sound from different distances, layering versions of the same movement until I felt surrounded by faint half-steps scattered through the dim light. I tightened my grip on the lantern, its glow trembling ever so slightly, and took another deliberate step forward, the thick crimson carpet swallowing the sound instantly. Yet the corridor answered with a sharper reply, a footstep striking the floor just behind my right heel, quicker than before, no longer waiting for me to finish my movement. Following with a hunger that felt newly awakened, the gas lamps along the wall flickered in uneven waves, their flames bowing inward as though bending toward a pull that drifted through the hallway, a pull that felt like a slow current of breath sliding beneath the wainscoting, a breath that thickened the air and brushed against my ankles with a chill that did not belong to any draft. 5. I could hear the wood beneath the carpet groan softly, the sound stretching in a long, trembling line as if the boards were shifting under invisible weight. And when I paused, the tremor continued without me, suggesting someone or something was still moving in the space my steps had occupied. Pacing in the rhythm it had learned from me, I whispered a careful hello into the stagnant air, my voice thin and tentative, and the corridor responded not with a single repetition, but with a chorus of soft syllables rising from different corners of the hallway. Faint, uncertain sounds that tried to shape the vowels of my greeting but broke them apart, scattering them into low murmurs that crawled along the carpet fibers and clung to the walls. The wainscoting quivered again. 5. A subtle ripple traveling down the length of the corridor, as though something brushed the inside of the paneling, tracing a path that mirrored the line of my spine with unnerving accuracy. I took another step, slower this time, my breath tightening as I listened for the reply, and it came instantly, the delayed footstep collapsing into perfect synchrony, landing at the exact moment my heel touched the floor. Not behind me now, but beside me, impossibly close. A presence walking in absolute parallel, though nothing visible occupied the space at my side. 5. The pressure of that step pressed through the carpet and into the wood beneath, releasing a low thrum that pulsed through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet until my heartbeat faltered in confused response. The corridor narrowed subtly, or perhaps the shadows thickened enough to make it seem so. The edges of the gas lamps blurring as the walls leaned inward in a slow creeping motion, not bending outward but breathing inward, drinking up the faint warmth of the light until the air felt as though it carried the taste of old stone and stale breath. 5 somewhere far down the hall, a new sound emerged, the echo of a footstep I had not taken, heavier, to slower, repeating itself in a steady insistence that did not belong to me, yet held the cadence of my own stride, as though the corridor were now creating steps ahead of me, laying a path I was expected to follow. I turned slowly toward the sound, the lantern trembling in my grasp, and for a moment the hallway deepened into a murky tunnel where the lights thinned and the carpet darkened, the air along that stretch vibrating with a low, resonant hum that grew louder with each passing second. A hum that matched the rhythm of the heavy echo sounding ahead. Each step it released, pulling at my senses with the strange familiarity of something I should have remembered but could not place. The boards beneath my feet shifted again, this time rising in tiny pulses, as if something beneath the floor was adjusting its position, aligning itself with the pacing that filled the hall, and the carpet swelled in a subtle wave that brushed against my boot, reacting to a step I had not taken, a step the corridor was beginning to take for me. The gas lamps dimmed further. 5, the shadows elongating as the hum deepened into a layered vibration, each layer carrying a faint ghost of a footstep, repeated endlessly, folding over itself until the air felt thick with the memory of movement. And as I stood there in that tightening corridor, surrounded by the multiplying echoes of my own steps and the heavy, unfamiliar stride resonating from ahead, I felt the guest house shift its attention fully upon me, as though the walls and floorboards and carpet fibers had decided in unspoken agreement that I belonged to this rhythm now, that my footsteps were no longer my own, but part of a growing pattern the corridor intended to complete. The heavy stride sounding from deeper in the corridor continued its slow, unyielding rhythm, a deliberate pattern that seemed to rearrange the air around it. And as I stood frozen beneath the dimming gas lamps, I realized the sound was no longer merely an echo or an imitation. It was approaching with a confidence that suggested the corridor had prepared this moment, rehearsed it even, waiting for me to step far enough into its silence for it to reveal the shape of its attention. I swallowed tightly, the faint tremor of the floorboards pulsing through my boots as though the wooden spine of the house were aligning itself beneath me, guiding the vibrations upward into my legs until my heartbeat synchronized with the slow, heavy cadence forming ahead. The lantern flickered in my hand, its flame bending toward the far end of the hall as if drawn by a draft. Yet the air was unnervingly still, heavy with the scent of old varnish and damp wool, the kind of stillness that feels inhabited rather than empty. And as the approaching footstep landed again, closer now, the wainscoting beside me exhaled in a soft inward creak, the panel bending ever so slightly toward the sound. Like a listener leaning forward to catch a whispered secret, I forced myself to take a step backward, and the instant my heel pressed into the carpet, the corridor responded with a flurry of overlapping murmurs, faint steps blooming across the length of the hallway, some behind me, some beside me, some so close I felt the brush of displaced air against my coat, as though my retreat had stirred not one echo but many, all eager to claim the rhythm I had offered earlier. boards underfoot shifted with a subtle upward swell, lifting and falling like the breath of something large lying beneath the floor. And the swell traveled outward until it met the slow, deliberate step still approaching from ahead. The merging vibrations created a low, resonant hum that filled my chest, tightening around my ribs like a belt being pulled one notch too many. And in the haze of the gaslight, I saw the shadows tremble along the walls, drawn into elongated forms that resembled silhouettes of walking figures, their shapes blurred yet unmistakably aligned with the rhythm pulsing through the corridor. Each shadow took a half step forward, then another, their movements growing more confident, more defined, responding to the heavy stride as though receiving instruction from it. I raised my lantern higher, hoping the light would cut through the haze, and the corridor reacted instantly. The flame, leaning outward, pulled toward an unseen presence approaching from the far bend, and as the light stretched, I saw the faint outline of a figure emerge, tall and still, not stepping yet, but standing in the center of the hall with a poise that suggested it had always been there, waiting for me to reach this precise point. The shape was not solid, more like a column of thickened shadow clothed in the dim amber glow of the lamps. And though no face was visible, I felt its gaze settle on me with an intimacy that chilled the air around my neck. The corridor tightened, the walls leaning inward in a slow, constricting sigh, trapping the air between us until the heavy silence pressed against my eardrums. And as I tried to take another step, the boards beneath me refused to yield, holding my weight in a firm grip as though the house itself had decided I should not move further. 5. Behind me, the soft, gliding steps of the mimic resumed. Slower now, deliberate, closing the gap with a patience that made my breath hitch in my throat, and I sensed its presence aligning itself directly at my back, mirroring the stance of the tall figure ahead. I whispered a tentative plea into the tightening space, not certain what I hoped to reach, and the corridor caught the sound greedily, swallowing it before it could travel more than an arm's length, then replaying it a heartbeat later in a stretched, trembling echo that came from the tall silhouette at the far end. The cadence warped, but unmistakably my own whispered breath returning to me from a shape that should not have been able to speak. The figure shifted, tilting slightly, an almost human gesture, and the floorboards responded with a guttural vibration, a rolling thrum that made the lantern flicker violently in my grasp. And at that moment, I understood the intent in the corridor's rhythm. Understood that the heavy approaching step had not been guiding me backward, but driving me forward, pushing me into alignment between the two presences that now stood in perfect symmetry, one in front, one behind, forming a corridor of echoes with me trapped between their converging rhythms. The wainscoting shuddered again, the gas lamps bowing inward as though acknowledging the moment, and the tall silhouette lifted one indistinct arm, the motion slow, tracing a path that drew faint ripples across the carpet as though the air itself were thickening into something with weight, something that pressed gently against my chest in an unspoken command to remain still. Behind me, the mimic lifted its arm in unison, the displaced air brushing the back of my coat with a cold, deliberate sweep. I realized then that the corridor was no longer imitating me. It was asking me to imitate it. The corridor held me in that unnerving stillness for what felt like a stretched, fragile eternity. The tall silhouette ahead raising its indistinct arm, while the presence behind mirrored it with a slow fluidity that pressed against the back of my coat like a suggestion rather than a touch. and in the thickening hum of the wooden walls, I felt the old structure of Graywell tighten around us as though bracing for something significant, something rehearsed long before my arrival. Yet just as the tension reached a point that made my breath thin and trembling, the tall figure slowly lowered its arm, letting it drift back to its side in a gesture so unexpectedly gentle that the corridor's hum softened at once, slipping from my ribs like a loosened grip and granting my lungs a breath that did not feel borrowed. The presence behind me loosened too, a faint shift in the carpet fibers suggesting it had stepped back or perhaps retreated into a softer stance. And though I could not see it, the release of pressure along my spine made my shoulders drop in cautious relief. As though some silent command had been rescinded, I dared a slow step to the left, preparing myself for the immediate mirrored reply. But none came, the carpet absorbing my weight quietly without coaxing any echo from behind or ahead. An absence so sudden that it startled me more than the mimicry itself. The gas lamps overhead brightened a little, their flames standing taller in their glass casings, and the shadows that had stretched toward the approaching silhouette eased back toward their natural shapes, softening along the wainscoting with the calm patience of a house exhaling after holding itself too stiffly for too long. The corridor widened subtly, or perhaps the pressure in my chest finally lifted enough for me to feel the space around me again. And in that new quiet, I felt a tentative, fragile reassurance looming along my nerves. The belief that the frightening choreography the corridor had forced upon me had ended. I lifted the lantern higher, its warm glow pushing gently through the haze, and the tall silhouette ahead wavered like a shadow caught in a soft rising wind before thinning into a darkened ripple and dissolving completely, leaving nothing but the empty stretch of hallway, carpeted and dim but no longer lined with waiting presences. 5. I watched the far bend for several long breaths, expecting the figure to reappear or shift back into place. But the only movement came from the faint sway of my lantern's glow along the paneling, a small private reassurance that I could see and move and breathe again under my own rhythm. The corridor behind me remained quiet as well, free of the delayed steps that had haunted my earlier movements. And when I let my hand graze lightly along the polished wainscot, the wood remained still beneath my touch, offering no tremor, no echo, no mimicry. Just the cool, smooth surface of well-tended Victorian craftsmanship. 5. A soft sense of triumph warmed my chest, thin but welcome, and for the first time since stepping into the East Hall, I allowed myself to believe I had misunderstood the threat, that the corridor's strange echoes had been brief anomalies, tricks of acoustics in an old house shifting in the night. I drew a careful breath and began to retrace my steps toward the guest room I had taken earlier, counting the lamps as I passed them to reassure myself of distance and orientation. And each lamp responded with steady, unwavering light, as though the building itself wished to soothe the unease it had stirred in me. The floor beneath my feet steadied, the faint rising pulses fading into ordinary stillness, allowing me to walk without the sense of the boards breathing beneath my boots. A faint warmth even crept back into the air. Not enough to dispel the November chill entirely, but enough to soften the sharpness that had cut through my earlier breaths. And I found myself imagining the comfort of the small oak writing desk in my room, the heavy blanket folded at the end of the bed, the quiet safety of four walls that had not yet tried to mimic my movements or speak in my voice. For a brief moment, I even felt foolish, the rational part of my mind insisting that no corridor, no matter how old or oddly constructed, could truly remember footsteps or create new ones. That what I had experienced must have been the settling of the wooden frame, the quirks of aging gas lines, shifting air through vents I had not seen. 5. The natural creaks and murmurs of a structure neglected by winter tourism. And as this comforting reasoning threaded itself through my thoughts, a softer calm settled over my shoulders, easing the last tension that clung there. It was only when I took another slow step, one hand gliding along the wainscoting in quiet reassurance, that I felt something almost imperceptible beneath my fingertips. A faint warmth radiating from the wood grain, as though the panel had held the memory of where I touched it earlier and was now replaying that warmth back to me in a gentle, delayed echo. Subtle and almost affectionate. Too soft to alarm, but too deliberate to ignore. And for the first time since the corridor released me, I understood that sometimes relief is not freedom at all, merely the patient pause of something that has not finished learning. The warmth beneath my fingertips lingered longer than any remnant of touch should have. A soft, growing pulse that traveled slowly through the wood grain and into my hand, as though the panel were gently breathing beneath my skin. And as I withdrew my fingers in startled caution, the warmth followed, sliding along the length of the wainscoting as though drawn to my retreat. A slow, invisible ripple that crept under the polished surface and whispered faint vibrations into the quiet air between the lamps. I took a careful step back, my breath tight, and the warmth paused as though waiting for a signal, then seeped forward again, not aggressively but insistently, like a memory refusing to fade. I raised the lantern higher, its golden glow wavering slightly, and in that unsteady light the corridor's familiar proportions felt subtly distorted, the edges softening into a gentle curvature as though the hall were bending toward me in a long, patient arc, and the carpet beneath my boots shifted with the faintest swell, its fibers rising, then settling as though reacting to the rhythm of my heartbeat, a rhythm that the corridor seemed to recognize now, perhaps even favor. The air thickened around me with a vibration so low it felt like the hush before a vast breath is taken, and I sensed the silence waiting for me to move again, to offer it another sound to remember. I whispered a soft please, not addressed to anything in particular, and the corridor caught the word instantly, swallowing it with quiet hunger before releasing it again in a stretched, wavering murmur that drifted from the far end of the hall. The voice unmistakably mine, yet altered, softened into something weaker, something that sounded as though it came from a version of me standing much farther away, trapped behind thick walls of cloth and wood. The hum beneath the floorboards answered that fragile echo with a deeper tremor, rising slowly like a tide pushing upward from the belly of the house, resonating just enough to make the lamps quiver in their brass fixtures. Instinct urged me to run, yet the corridor's strange gentleness held me in place, the warmth still following the line of the wainscoting like a guiding presence. And when I shifted my weight toward the stairwell, the warmth retreated a little, as if encouraging the motion, as if yielding the path back toward safety. And for a moment relief washed through my chest with such clarity that my breath loosened, my shoulders dropping as I allowed myself to believe the corridor had decided to release me fully. No echo trailing my steps, no silhouette approaching from the dimness ahead. I took another step backward, toward the bend that led to the guest rooms. and the corridor remained quiet, offering no mimicry, no delayed footfall pressing into the carpet, no ripple beneath the floorboards. And the sight of the hallway opening gently toward the familiar oak door of my room filled me with a sense of fragile hope. I moved again, slower this time, letting the lantern light settle along the walls, and the corridor seemed content to watch, the shadows steady, the air still, the faint warmth along the wainscot easing further away. Yet, as I turned the corner, the silence shifted, not breaking but tightening, as though the space behind me had inhaled and frozen that breath against the back of my neck. And from somewhere deep inside the timbered structure came a single low resonance, a hum too deep to be heard clearly, rumbling through the floorboards like a warning whispered through a hollow beam. The sound traveled beneath me in a straight, deliberate line, passing under my boots with a slow, steady vibration before continuing down the hall toward the stairwell, as though the building itself were tracing my path, marking it carefully. Studying it in reverse, I quickened my pace, my boots sinking softly into the carpet, and the corridor stayed quiet for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. Then the silence began to fold in on itself as faint, muffled footsteps bloomed in the distance behind me. Not the delayed echoes from before, but steps that were heavier, closer, and out of sync with any movement I had made. Footsteps that seemed to belong to someone walking toward the very place I had just left, as though another presence in the corridor had begun retracing my steps with persistent accuracy. I glanced back, the lantern's glow sweeping along the edges of the wainscot, and for a moment the hall behind me appeared unchanged, the lamp steady, the carpet still, the shadows settled harmlessly against the walls. But then the farthest lamp flickered, its flame bending sharply inward as though something tall had passed in front of it, and a shiver of motion traveled down the length of the corridor. Not loud, but perceptible. A shift in the air like a body moving with great care. The footsteps grew clearer, each one deliberate, each one placed with practiced control. And as I backed toward my room, the vibration beneath the floor returned, no longer gentle but steady and purposeful, rising in intensity as though the corridor were guiding the approaching presence along an invisible track leading directly to me. The wainscoting trembled with small rhythmic pulses, each one matching the cadence of the unseen steps, and the warmth that had trailed my touch earlier now seeped outward from the walls, converging slowly toward the point where I stood as if narrowing the space around me. I reached my room door, fumbling slightly with the handle, and the moment the latch clicked, the footsteps behind me stopped, the silence dropping so abruptly it felt like a weight falling through the air. And for a brief, fragile second I believed I had outrun whatever the corridor had summoned, that the threshold of my room offered protection the hall could not breach. I slipped inside, closing the door softly, leaning against the wood as my breath shook free of my chest, grateful for the solid, unmoving floor beneath me, the familiar scent of oak and old paper rising from the desk, the safe, ordinary quiet that had greeted me earlier in the evening. But as I lowered the lantern and pressed my ear to the door, a new sound emerged from the other side, soft at first, then growing in deliberate measures, the unmistakable pattern of footsteps resuming, now pacing outside my room in slow, careful arcs, tracing circles in the carpet as though drawing a boundary around my space. And between those slow, circular steps came a fainter rhythm, a quieter version of the same pattern, 5 out of sync by the smallest margin, as though two entities were walking together, one leading, one learning, their combined pace forming a steady, pulsing cadence that pressed through the door and into my bones. And when I stepped back from the door, heart sinking, I heard the corridor release a final low hum, a hum shaped unmistakably like the beginning of my own footstep, as though preparing to finish it for me. I stepped away from the door, my breath catching in the lantern's unsteady glow, and for a moment the pacing outside softened into a strange, gentle shuffle, as though the corridor were rearranging its rhythm with careful patience, preparing a new pattern to offer. And as I listened, the air within my room seemed to shift subtly, the silence thinning into a faint tremor that pricked at the edges of my hearing like the beginning of a faraway heartbeat. Then the footsteps changed, not in volume, but in intention, the cadence stretching into a sequence I did not recognize, slower than mine, steadier, bearing an uncanny deliberation. And with each new step, the rhythm grew clearer, arranging itself into a pattern with a peculiar familiarity that rose slowly from the back of my memory. I focused on that cadence, trying to place it, and as each step landed against the carpeted floor outside, I realized with a quiet, sinking chill that the rhythm did not match anything I had walked tonight. Not the hurried steps of my retreat, not the cautious ones taken earlier in fear, but something else entirely. A sequence of movement that I had not yet made. 5. A pace slightly heavier, slightly more fatigued, as though the corridor were replaying a version of me that had already lived through another hour, another day, another encounter within these walls. My breath stilled as the truth settled in a slow, cold wave, for the footsteps outside my door carried the exact rhythm of someone exhausted, someone returning from a place I had not visited yet. Each step weighted with the echo of a moment I had not experienced, and when the corridor released a faint murmur between those steps, a soft, tremulous whisper shaped like my own voice drained of all warmth, I understood with a terrible trembling clarity that the hall was no longer mimicking my past, but rehearsing my future. The footsteps halted directly outside my room, 2 sets of breaths rising in the stillness, one a fraction behind the other, and through the wood of the door, I felt the faintest pressure against the panel, the gentle brush of a hand that moved in the same slow arc my future self would make, tracing a pattern I had not yet learned. And as the lantern flickered low, the corridor whispered my name in a voice that did not belong to me yet, a voice carrying the tired weight of tomorrow. Story 3, The Subterranean Choir. My name is Rowan Ellard, and at 1:40 in the morning on the 12th of March 2021, I stood alone beside the metal entrance hatch of Langthorne Ridge Observatory, the cold breath of the North York moors drifting in slow silver ribbons across the ground as though the entire landscape were exhaling beneath the weight of the fog. And when I set my hand against the rust-chilled handle, 5, a deep, resonant hum rose faintly from the earth below. A single, unbroken note that felt less like sound and more like vibration sliding through my bones with unsettling familiarity. The observatory behind me loomed silent in the dark, its old brick walls absorbing what little moonlight pierced the mist. And as I descended the first iron ladder rung into the narrow shaft, the hum grew clearer, shaping itself into an eerie low harmony that pulsed in a steady rhythm. Not chaotic like wind. 5, not random like shifting rock, but measured, deliberate, almost human in its breath-like swell, and with each rung I climbed downward. The note thickened until it felt as though the unseen choir beneath the moor had already sensed my arrival and was drawing its next breath to greet me. The deeper I descended into the access shaft, the more the hum thickened into a living presence around me, swelling in slow tidal breaths that pressed gently against my chest as though testing the rhythm of my heartbeat. 5. And when my boots reached the stone floor of the first survey tunnel, the air shifted with a subtle vibration that made the stray dust along the walls tremble in soft drifting patterns, rising and falling as if mimicking the movement of my own breath. I lifted my headlamp, letting its pale beam sweep across the damp limestone, and in its narrow halo I saw faint ripples spreading along the ground, tiny shivers in the dust that moved as though responding to a pulse I could not hear yet felt deep in my sternum, a low coaxing thrum that seemed to tug my breath into slower, more measured intervals. I tried to steady myself, whispering a brief note to test the acoustics, expecting the sound to flatten instantly the way it usually did in narrow tunnels. But instead, my whisper lingered in the air like smoke suspended in still water, held upright by the low harmony rising from deeper below. And as it thinned into silence, the hum shifted gently upward in pitch, almost as though it were answering, or worse, adjusting itself to the sound I had made. A shiver crept beneath my coat as I took a cautious step forward, and the tunnel answered with a faint oscillation. 5, the stone beneath my soul, vibrating in a slow pulse that repeated itself along the walls. Guiding the hum into an even steadier beat, I forced myself to breathe more naturally, yet each inhale seemed to meet a soft resistance, as though the air were shaping itself around my lungs, urging me toward a rhythm that was not quite my own. And with every exhale, the hum swelled slightly, matching the length of my breath with unnerving accuracy. Somewhere ahead, the tunnel curved into darkness, the stone narrowing into a throat-like passage that carried the vibration more clearly, amplifying it into a low harmonic wave that made the back of my neck tingle as though brushed by unseen fingertips. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, and the limestone beneath my palm responded with a faint warmth, a subtle trembling that traveled up my arm in increments, like the pulse of something vast and patient waiting deep below the moor. And for a fleeting instant, I felt the unsettling sense that the choir beneath me was not merely producing sound, but listening closely, adjusting itself to every breath I took, every step I hesitated to make. Instinct whispered that I should turn back, climb the ladder, and let the cold, open air of the moor wash this crawling sensation from my ribs. Yet the hum coaxed me forward with a gentle inevitability, pulling at the center of my chest with the same quiet persistence as a distant melody that refuses to leave the mind. The moment I took another step, the hum rose again, this time bending into a resonance that echoed faintly in my throat, vibrating along the edges of my voice box with a familiarity that set my teeth on edge. And I realized with a slow, cold clarity that the sound beneath the moor was no longer simply growing louder. It was beginning to sound eerily, impossibly. Like me, the resonance clinging to my throat deepened as I moved further into the narrowing limestone passage, each step drawing the hum into sharper focus until it wrapped around my sternum like a tightening coil, guiding my breaths into long measured waves that matched its slow subterranean rhythm. And as my lungs reluctantly adapted, The tunnel air thickened with vibrations that felt almost alive, sliding like invisible currents along my ribs and gathering near my collarbones with a pressure that was neither painful nor gentle, but weighted with an eerie sense of expectation. I lifted my headlamp again, watching the beam quiver in the vibrating air, the light bending in faint distortions as if passing through a veil of heat. Though the tunnel remained cold enough for my breath to rise in pale drifting arcs, with each meter I advanced, the hum evolved. No longer a single unbroken note, but layered now with subtle harmonics that rose and fell in slow, deliberate intervals, forming the shape of a choir whose voices blended into one vast breath, a breath that pulsed through the stone and into my bones with unnerving ease. And as I listened, the upper harmonic wavered in a pattern that traced the cadence of my own inhalations, extending them, elongating them, urging them into unnatural lengths that made my chest strain to keep pace. I tried to resist, to inhale and exhale on my own terms, yet the hum nudged back each time, adjusting itself in tiny increments that coaxed my lungs gently but insistently into obedience. The tunnel widened slightly ahead, opening into a chamber where the air vibrated with such intensity that fine dust rose continuously from the floor, suspended in the thick harmonic wave like pale, shimmering grains caught in the flow of an unseen river. And as I stepped inside, the chamber walls seemed to tremble with breath-like contractions, tightening, then easing, as if responding to my presence, shaping the acoustics around me with calculated intention. The hum swelled once more, and in that rising tide I felt a faint answering vibration within my own throat, a soft, involuntary tremor that made my breath quaver as though something deep within me were attempting to sing back. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the strange resonance. But the moment my palm touched my ribs, the hum shifted again, dipping into a lower register that traveled through my arm like a warm current, flowing up to my shoulder and then curling around the base of my skull in a slow, spiraling motion that made my vision pulse in time with the unseen choir. In that dizzying cadence, I realized the sound beneath the moor was not only guiding my breath, but gently altering my internal rhythm, shaping the subtle pulse behind my sternum into intervals that matched its vast subterranean beat. The chamber air thickened further, carrying faint overtones that wavered in uncanny mimicry of my voice. Soft rising contours that sounded like the beginnings of words I had whispered earlier in the shaft, stretched into airy extensions that hung trembling in the space just beyond my reach. And as those ghost-like echoes drifted around me, I felt a growing pull from the far end of the chamber where the tunnel dipped deeper, the vibrations funneling toward that descending passage like a slow gathering tide. It felt as though the choir beneath the moor were drawing breath there, waiting for me to step into the narrow throat of stone so it could exhale in full. I took another hesitant breath, trying to keep it short, controlled, but the hum met the resistance with subtle pressure, swelling at the edges of my lungs until the breath stretched involuntarily into a long-drawn inhalation that left my chest aching in its final moments. And the instant I exhaled in a shaking release, the harmonics rose in a perfect echo, matching not only the length but the faint tremor embedded in the breath, a mimicry so exact that it felt impossibly intimate, as though whatever sang beneath the moor now knew my breath better than I did. A faint warmth crept up the back of my neck, a sign of the air thickening further with resonance. and the deeper overtone began to pulse so powerfully through the chamber walls that small flakes of limestone drifted down like pale ash, stirring slowly in the vibrating air before dissolving into its rhythm. And with each falling fragment, the hum bent more toward the shape of my voice, its timbre shifting, its cadence adjusting, gathering the subtle imperfections of my breathing pattern and weaving them into its immense sonic body, as though preparing to complete something it had begun. And in that heavy, swelling harmony, I finally understood that the choir beneath Langthorn Ridge was not merely echoing me, but absorbing me, folding the signature of my breath into its vast, continuous note, as if preparing for the moment when I would no longer breathe independently at all. The chamber's vibrating air gathered around me in slow, undulating waves, each swell brushing against my ribs with the familiarity of a hand that had studied my breathing for far too long. And as I stood in the shifting dust, a rising overtone threaded itself through the main hum, forming a trembling ribbon of sound that curled toward my face with a presence so distinct it felt almost like a voice leaning close to speak without words. I lifted my headlamp to trace the direction of the sound, its beam quivering in the vibrating air, and as the light passed across the far wall, the limestone rippled in a way that did not belong to stone. Thin lines of dust, lifting and falling in patterns too coordinated to be random, swirling into the faint outline of something tall that waited just beyond the reach of full visibility. I stepped back instinctively, and the hum answered with a deep, resonant swell that pressed into my chest like a firm guiding palm, coaxing rather than forcing, yet leaving no doubt that the unseen choir had noticed my hesitation. And in that rising swell I heard a soft second voice, fainter but eerily familiar, 5, vibrating at the same pitch as my own involuntary tremor, a voice shaped from the cadence of my breath, as if the hum had reached into my lungs earlier and was now returning what it had taken. The outline on the wall thickened, dust rising in a shimmering veil that pulsed in time with the hum, and the faint shape leaned forward with a movement too fluid for stone, too deliberate for shifting air, its upper form bending with the same arc my own shadow made when I exhaled heavily against cold morning light. 5, and I realized with a creeping unease that the chamber had begun to reflect me, not with sight, but with sound, shaping the vibrations into a silhouette constructed from my own breath and heartbeat. I whispered a quiet stop, the word escaping in a thin stream of breath, and the chamber caught it instantly, stretching the sound into a long, wavering note that climbed the walls and settled into the outline, filling the shape with a trembling glow of dust that pulsed with my syllable until it no longer sounded like language. 5. Only resonance. Only an extension of the hum already waiting beneath my ribs. The air around me thickened again, narrowing into a pressure that made my own breathing falter. 5. My lungs guided into a slower rhythm that matched the contour of the hum, as though my body had been invited into a duet without my consent. The outline moved once more, a slow, tilting motion that angled its head-like shape toward me. And in the swelling harmonics, I felt the subtle shift of attention, the sensation of being scanned not by eyes, but by resonance itself. 5, as though the vibration traveling through the chamber were learning the small tremors woven into my bones, memorizing them with an intimacy that made my skin tighten. I tried to step backward, but the stone beneath my boot vibrated upward in a gentle refusal. 5, a tremor that held my foot in place with a softness that nonetheless carried the weight of a command. I felt a faint tug inside my throat, a subtle tightening that rose in time with the choir, and before I could swallow it away, a thin note escaped me, a small, involuntary release of breath shaped into sound by the hum surrounding me. 5. And the moment it slipped into the air, the outline on the wall responded in perfect synchrony, its dust shimmering brighter as it sang the same thin note back to me, bending it into a longer version that resonated through the chamber like an echo that had been waiting for years to be completed. My breath hitched, but the hum caught it, stretching it, smoothing it, shaping it into the next interval of its vast, continuous tone. And with each manipulated inhale, the outline grew clearer, the dust coalescing into a form that bore my height, my posture, even the slight tilt of my shoulders, yet its proportions stretched unnaturally, elongated by resonance rather than bone, as though the choir had begun sculpting an imitation of me from the vibration itself. When I tried to speak again, no words formed, only a trembling breath that the chamber seized eagerly, weaving it into the layered harmony that rose now like a wave preparing to crest. And as the choir's pressure gathered around my lungs, guiding them into a rhythm no longer my own, I understood with a sinking clarity that the presence in the chamber was not trying to mimic me anymore. It was trying to make me sing with it. For a long, trembling moment, the chamber held me in that suffocating harmony, the hum rising and falling around my ribs like an unseen tide waiting to pull me under. Yet just as the pressure reached a point where my lungs shuddered in its grip, the resonance abruptly softened, retreating from my chest with a slow easing motion that felt almost compassionate. 5. As if the vast choir beneath the moor had decided to loosen its hold rather than snap me into silence. And the outline on the far wall flickered. Its dust made form thinning into a faint shimmering veil that drifted slowly back toward the floor until the shape dissolved entirely into the vibrating air. The sudden release left me swaying where I stood, my breath fluttering in uneven waves as I tried to reclaim it. And to my astonishment, the hum no longer pushed against my inhalations, no longer coaxed my lungs into unnatural lengths. Instead, it hovered at a respectful distance, a gentle, low tone that vibrated like a warning buried beneath a lullaby. And as I took another shaky breath, I found myself believing the worst had passed, that the choir had misjudged my presence or tired of the experiment it had begun, leaving me free to regain command of my own rhythm. I lifted my hand slowly, testing the air, and the chamber gave no response. No answering tremor twisting the dust at my fingertips. No echo threading itself into the motion. Only the faint warmth of my glove brushing through the vibrating space like a fragile private act. And this quiet lack of mimicry soothed me more deeply than I expected. 5. Easing the tension that had been building along my spine since I entered the tunnel. Even the limestone walls appeared still now, their breath-like contractions settling into the natural cold patience of untouched stone, and the headlamp beams steadied enough to make the chamber feel grounded once more. I told myself I could leave, that nothing in this place intended to drag me further down, and as I took a step backward, toward the narrowing tunnel that led to the ladder shaft, the chamber remained silent, letting my boots settle into the thin layer of dust without tugging at the rhythm of my movement. And for the first time since descending into Langthorn Ridge, I felt something like safety returning to me, faint but tangible, threading through the vibrating air with cautious promise. Another step, slower this time, and still no reply from the stone or the hum. No echo of my breath reshaped into harmony. No dust rising to form the outline that had stared so intently at me moments earlier. And I felt the relief settle more firmly into my chest, steadying my breath into something that felt like my own once more. Even the distant harmonics softened, folding inward like the closing of many unseen lungs preparing to sleep. The choir beneath the moor, retreating into whatever depth had birthed it. When I reached the edge of the chamber, the vibrations thinned into a faint tremor that brushed lazily against my boots but carried no urgency. And as I stepped into the narrowing corridor, my shoulders eased for the first time. 5, the oppressive weight lifting enough for me to raise my head fully without feeling the hum constricting the back of my throat. 5, I began to think I had misunderstood the intent of the resonance. That perhaps the hum was a natural phenomenon after all, an accidental harmony shaped by ancient stone beds, an acoustic trap that had momentarily aligned with my breath, but held no malice toward me. I whispered a tentative thank you into the dim tunnel, embarrassed by the impulse, yet comforted by the sound of my own voice, untouched by any echoing harmony. And when the whisper faded without reply, I let myself exhale in a long, steady breath, relieved to hear only my own lungs filling the quiet. The sense of being alone finally returning with gentle certainty. 5. But as I took one more cautious step toward the shaft, the hum deep beneath the moor shifted, not rising, not swelling, but bending into a low, rolling cadence that did not press against my ribs this time, instead drifting up the tunnel in a slow, curious sweep as though brushing past me. And the sensation made me pause mid-step, my breath catching as I realized the hum was no longer reaching for my lungs, but passing through me. 5. As if searching for something it believed I had left behind in the chamber. The air around my throat trembled faintly, a small involuntary quiver like the ghost of a note trying to form. And for a moment, I felt certain it was only the residue of fear loosening its grip, a natural tremor following the overwhelming pressure I had felt earlier. But then the quiver returned, a little stronger, a little clearer. 5. Rising not from the chamber behind me, but from within the narrow column of my throat. And with each faint vibration, the hum beneath the moor responded with a soft, welcoming resonance, as though greeting a developing harmony. 5. And in that fragile, quivering moment, I realized the choir had not let me go at all. It had simply planted its breath inside mine. The tremor lingering in my throat grew with each hesitant breath, a quiet pulse that fluttered just beneath my voice box like a second heartbeat trying to find its rhythm. And as I stood at the edge of the narrowing passage, the hum beneath the moor responded in a gentle rising swell, a sound so warm and patient that for a moment I felt an irrational comfort in it, as though the vast subterranean choir were welcoming me into something I had unknowingly begun, something it had been shaping inside me from the moment I descended the iron ladder. I pressed a hand to my throat, feeling the faint vibration thrum against my palm, and in that subtle resonance I sensed the quiet persistence of the sound growing, stitching itself into my breath with a determination too calm to be resisted. The corridor before me darkened as the headlamp flickered, the beam bending in faint ripples as though the air itself were thickening into layers of sound. And with each ripple my lungs tightened, following the rhythm not of my own will, but of the measured humming pulse rising from the depths. I tried to force a sharp exhale to break the synchronization, expelling the breath before the hum could shape it. But the moment it left my lungs, the choir caught it, it stretched it, and returned it up the tunnel in a soft, drawn echo that brushed along my spine with the intimacy of a whisper learning my shape. 5. I staggered backward, refusing to let the rhythm settle, and for a heartbeat, the hum dimmed as though surprised, its harmonics dipping into a subdued flutter that quivered along the walls like the rustle of unseen wings. But the tremor inside my throat betrayed me, tightening again in a faint, involuntary pulse that sent a responsive ripple back into the air, and the choir seized upon it instantly, weaving it into its layered resonance with a tenderness that frightened me more than any force could have. A tenderness that implied the harmony had already claimed a part of me it would not release. The tunnel constricted around me as the hum swelled into a richer, deeper note. The limestone contracting with soft groans that vibrated through my boots and into my legs, guiding me backwards step by step as though urging me to return to the chamber, to the place where the choir had begun shaping me more fully. I resisted. 5. Clinging to the roughness of the wall to anchor myself, and the stone beneath my fingers trembled with a rhythmic pulse that matched the cadence rising in my throat, my own breath becoming the corridor's metronome in a way that made my knees weaken. I whispered a strained no, hoping the word would shatter the delicate alignment, but the sound wavered, breaking into a tremulous note halfway through, and the choir surged upward eagerly, catching the fractured syllable and folding it into its massive, breath-like swell until my voice no longer belonged to me. 5. Drifting down the corridor in a long harmonic ribbon that made the dust rise from the floor in shimmering spirals, guided by my unwilling melody. The spirals drifted toward the chamber, coaxing me with their lazy, pulsing motion, a visual echo of the breath the choir wanted me to surrender fully. I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the ladder shaft instead, and the hum descended in pitch, not in anger, but in a low, patient exhale that followed me like a steady hand at my back, the kind meant to guide rather than restrain. Yet its presence pressed through the tunnel with such vastness that my own breath quavered uncontrollably, vibrating against the walls of my throat until the beginnings of another note slipped out without my consent. I clamped a hand over my mouth, but the vibration continued beneath my skin, shaping itself even without release, resonating faintly through the bones of my jaw until the choir answered it with a soft rising trill that felt unbearably intimate. My knees buckled at the base of the ladder shaft and I clung to the metal rung, feeling the vibration travel up the steel like a pulse running through a living limb. And as I lifted my head, I saw the dust in the tunnel begin to lift again, pulled by a subtle draft that carried the hum upward through the shaft, inviting my breath to follow. The air here vibrated with warmer tones now, harmonics that wrapped around my lungs like a cradle, and in their gentle insistence I heard something that made my blood turn cold. A faint emerging voice woven into the hum, not quite formed yet, unmistakably built from the contours of my own words. The beginnings of my own speech reshaped into song. With a desperate surge, I hauled myself up the first rung, forcing my breath into short, erratic bursts that the choir struggled to follow, the broken rhythm confusing the harmonics long enough for me to gain a second rung, then a third. And with every uneven inhalation, the hum faltered, its harmony losing shape as though the choir were trying to grasp shifting smoke. I climbed quickly, grasping short breaths, refusing the long, measured inhalations the hum tried to coax from me. for the first time, the resonance behind me grew unsteady, its deep foundation quivering in a trembling effort to catch the tatters of my breath. The shaft narrowed around me as I climbed, the metal walls vibrating with the distant hum still rising through the stone. Yet, as the cold air of the moor neared, drifting down the shaft in a thin, clear breeze, the tremor in my throat weakened, the involuntary pulse flickering like a candle losing its wick, and the choir's answering swell grew strained, pulling at me with a sound both yearning and fading, as though some great throat beneath the earth were struggling to complete a note that required the breath I had stolen back. My fingers reached the final rung just as the hum surged one last time. A vast, trembling exhale that rose through the shaft with such force it made the ladder shiver under my grip, and for a breath I felt the vibration seize my chest again, pulling at the air inside me with a longing that tasted like the echo of my own voice reaching after me from the deep. But the moment I broke through the hatch and collapsed onto the frosted ground of the moor, the cold night air struck me like a cleansing wave, wrenching the resonance from my throat with a sudden raw gasp that left the hum below collapsing into a hollow, trembling sigh. I crawled away from the hatch until the vibrations slipped from my bones entirely, the choir's resonance thinning into a distant, trembling murmur deep beneath the earth, a sound no longer strong enough to shape my breath, no longer able to pull my voice into its vast, continuous note. And as the fog drifted low across the moor, the last stray tremor faded from my throat in a faint shiver that felt almost like goodbye. I lay on the cold ground of the moor, the hatch partly open behind me, its metal edges trembling with the last exhausted sighs of the choir below. And for a long, fragile stretch of silence, I dared to believe it was over, that the hum had loosened its hold and slipped back into the depths where it belonged, leaving my breath once again my own. The night air felt thin and still against my throat, almost tender in its quiet. And as I pressed a shaking hand to my chest, relief swept through me in a soft, unsteady wave, the kind that follows a danger narrowly escaped. But then, as the fog drifted across my face in a pale whisper, I felt a faint vibration beneath my jaw, so small I might have mistaken it for the quiver of cold. Yet the tremor grew, rising through my throat with an all-too-familiar cadence, and before I could swallow it down, a thin note escaped me, a soft, drawn hum that did not belong to any breath I chose to release. The sound curled into the air like a thread of warm smoke, matching perfectly the pitch that had been echoing beneath the moor moments earlier. And as it hovered before fading into the open night, a cold realization tightened around my ribs. I pressed both hands to my mouth, struggling to hold the next vibration in place. But the hum inside me only gathered strength, rising with slow, patient confidence, as though it had merely been waiting for the quiet to settle, waiting for the world above to still enough for it to step forward. And when I finally exhaled in a shaky gasp, a second note slipped free, deeper this time, fuller, resonating not from the ground below, but from the hollow of my own chest, as though my lungs had already begun to remember the choir's rhythm without needing its call. The hatch behind me remained silent, no echo rising from the depths, no vibration answering mine. And that silence struck me harder than any sound could have, for in the absence of the subterranean choir, the note trembling from my throat continued to grow, shaping itself into something steady, something continuous, something that felt horribly like the beginning of a harmony, And as I knelt there beneath the rolling fog, the first true breath of the choir rose from within me. Quiet but unmistakably alive. Story 4. The Windows That Blink. My name is Mara Linton, and at 11 on a mist-soaked night in late February 2023, I stood alone in my flat on the 15th floor of Calder Place residence, overlooking the dim neon haze of central Manchester. 5. The city shifting behind the fog like a restless animal, half hidden in its own breath. And as I leaned against the wide glass window that spanned the entire north wall of my living room, the lights below flickered in a strange synchronized pulse. 5, each glow dipping, then swelling as though something vast were passing behind the curtain of mist and brushing against the electric veins of the streets below. I watched the city blink once, twice, the rhythm too clean to be accidental, and in the soft hum of the radiator at my back, I could hear a faint, brittle sound rising from the window itself. A quiet click, like the shutter of a camera pressed by an unseen hand. Delicate yet deliberate. 5. And each time the light outside dipped, the glass under my fingertips quivered, as if responding to a signal I had not heard. A breath I had not taken. A moment I had not lived yet. The faint clicking against the window pane lingered in the air long after the city lights steadied themselves. A delicate metallic twitch that seemed to vibrate along the cold glass, even when nothing outside moved. And as I stood there with my palm resting against the pane, I felt a subtle tremor rising through it. Not the solid hum of distant traffic, or the high whine of the wind against the building, but a soft, irregular pulse, almost like the quiet tapping of a fingertip tracing hesitant patterns from the other side of the glass. I leaned closer, letting my breath fog a small corner of the pane, and in that blurred patch of condensation, the shifting lights of Manchester warped into strange, elongated shapes. Buildings stretching into thin vertical smears, as though the city beneath me were being drawn downward by unseen hands. For a moment, the mist outside thinned just enough for me to glimpse the streetlights weaving through the fog, their reflections scattering like pale golden threads across the glass. And as I watched the glow settle into its usual steady rhythm, a sudden flicker rippled across the skyline again. Sharper this time. 5. A synchronized dimming that moved from west to east in a smooth wave. Almost as if some enormous shape had passed between the scattered lights of the city and the low-hanging clouds, blocking out the glow in a single, deliberate sweep. The window responded with another soft click, lighter than before, but eerily timed. A sound that felt as though it came from somewhere inside the glass rather than beyond it. 5. I stepped back to steady myself, wrapping my arms around my ribs as the radiator hummed faintly behind me. Yet even with the warmth, a peculiar chill crept along my spine. The kind that comes not from cold, but from the sense of being watched by something that has not yet chosen to reveal itself. And as I turned away from the glass to blink the unease from my mind, the room remained eerily still, the shadows lying flat against the walls, the air carrying none of the usual hum of city life drifting up 15 floors. It felt as if the entire building were listening rather than existing. When I turned back to the window, the surface had cleared of my breath's condensation, yet a faint outline remained. Not the shape of my hand or my face, but a thin, wavering streak that ran vertically down the center of the pane, as though something tall had brushed against the glass from the outside. 5, leaving behind a barely visible trail that shimmered slightly under the dim interior light. I reached out tentatively, letting my fingers hover just above the streak, half afraid to touch it. And the moment my hand neared the surface, the lights outside blinked again. A brief, synchronized pulse that plunged the city into a soft shadow before returning with a gentle shudder. This time, the click from the window came not as a single delicate sound, but as two rapid whispers of impact, like the flutter of an unseen shutter capturing something too quick for my eyes to follow. And in that fleeting double click, I felt the unmistakable sensation that the window had not just reacted to the blinking lights. 5. It had anticipated them. The double click still echoed in the quiet of my flat long after the city lights steadied again. A faint metallic aftertaste in the air that seemed to cling to the inside of the window as though the glass itself were holding its breath. And as I stepped closer, my reflection wavered across the pane in soft ripple-like motions that did not match my movements. My shadowed outline shifting a half-beat too slow, as though the glass needed time to decide what shape to return to me. I lifted my fingers toward the surface, not quite touching, and the subtle tremor running through the pane deepened into a thin vibration that pressed lightly against my nails, whispering upward into the bones of my hand with the same gentle urgency as a quiet voice asking to be acknowledged. 5. Outside, the mist thickened into a pale drifting veil that smudged the lights of Manchester into wandering blurs. 5 long vertical strokes of gold and blue that shifted like underwater lanterns. And each time the glow warped, the window beneath my fingertips responded with a delicate stutter. A short, rhythmic tick that echoed faintly through the interior of the glass, as if tiny mechanisms inside the pane were resetting themselves in anticipation. When the mist rolled away from a cluster of lights in the distance, the glass clicked again. 5. A small, crisp note that struck in perfect synchrony with the sudden swell of brightness rising from the city below, and the sensation tingled across the tips of my fingers like static trying to take shape. 5. The radiator hummed behind me in its steady domestic way, yet even its warmth seemed unable to soften the strange electric chill that seeped slowly through the glass. The cold pressing outward rather than inward, as though something on the far side were drawing heat toward itself in tiny, measured breaths, each one timed to the flickering of the distant lights. I stepped back cautiously, and the entire window seemed to exhale, its surface relaxing with a faint creak that vibrated through the frame, followed immediately by another soft shudder-like click, quieter now, almost shy, as if responding to my retreat with an adjusting lens of its own. 5. I moved toward the lamp in the corner of the room, switching it on in the hope that steady, warm light might drown out the eerie rhythm outside. But as the bulb flared to life, the reflection in the window adjusted with unnerving precision, the glass brightening in perfect tandem, and then dimming by a fraction of a second afterward. The lag so subtle yet unmistakable, as though the window were not reflecting my room at all, but recreating it, rebuilding the light in its own time, its own deliberate sequence. The click that followed this shift was softer, a tiny tapping heartbeat that pulsed twice, then steadied, echoing the new glow behind me. 5. A sudden surge of wind swept along the building's exterior, rattling faintly against metal and concrete, yet the window remained unnervingly still, the glass refusing to shiver with the gust the way any normal pane would, and instead the faint vibration inside it strengthened, tightening into a thin, resonant tone that hummed just below hearing. teasing the edge of my senses like a low-frequency test I had not been warned about. My breath fogged the lower part of the pane, and as the mist cleared, the reflection staring back at me flickered. Not the whole image, but the eyes. A tiny moment of double exposure where my own gaze seemed to blink a fraction of a second after I did. A delayed motion captured and released with a soft mechanical tick. The city lights blinked again, a rolling dimming that washed across the buildings like a slow, silent wave. And this time the window shuddered sharply, the click loud enough to travel along the entire frame in a swift metallic flutter, as if several shutters had fired in rapid succession deep within the layered glass. The vibrations spread outward in a thin, radiating pattern, tapping lightly against the inside of the pane in a rhythm that made the hairs on my arms lift one by one, each tap landing a heartbeat behind the last like fingertips, drumming on a table in deliberate mimicry. I whispered a quiet stop, barely louder than a breath, and for a moment the pane obeyed, falling completely still, the mist outside freezing in its drifting motion as though the world had paused in recognition of the word. But then a new click sounded, softer than the others, yet closer somehow, not from the surface of the window, but from deep within the thickness of the glass itself. A tiny captured echo that did not follow the city's rhythm but mine. One click answering the small tremor of fear that pulsed in my throat. And when the next sequence of clicks came, slow and intentional, each one timed exactly to the beating of my heart, I realized the window was no longer reacting to the city outside. 5. It was watching me instead. 5. The rhythmic clicking paced itself with the steady beat of my heart for several breathless moments, each faint tap echoing through the glass, as though the pane were leaning closer to listen. And as I stood in the center of my living room with the lamp casting a soft golden glow around me, I felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle over the air, the kind of weight that makes a room feel smaller than it is, as though the walls themselves had shifted a fraction inward while my eyes were turned away. I approached the window slowly, feeling the carpet hush my steps into near silence. And with every inch I drew nearer, the clicks softened, gathering into a delicate tremor that shimmered faintly beneath the surface of the glass, like something aware of my approach and adjusting its breathing to match mine. 5. The city below seemed impossibly distant now, its scattered lights dissolving into pale smudges beneath the rolling fog. And as I reached the cold pane, the reflection staring back at me gleamed with a strange half-second delay, my face lifting slightly after I had already begun to turn, my shoulders straightening just a fraction too late. A soft echo of my posture forming in the glass, as though the reflection itself were hesitating, waiting for some unseen cue before committing to.